Thanks for joining us. This is The What Now. We'll begin here in Africa, Senegal precisely, where Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko has confirmed he would stay in his role as Prime Minister instead of taking up the job of President of the National Assembly. The decision follows his party's performance in Senegal's recent snap parliamentary elections, where the ruling PASTEF party, led by President Bassirou Diomaye Faye and Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko, secured 130 seats out of 165 seats in the National Assembly. The victory was one of the largest majorities ever won by a single party in the West African nation. It triggered speculation over whether Mr. Ousmane Sonko should step down as Prime Minister to leave the National Assembly in the interest of institutional balance. Malik Ndiaye, the country's current Minister of Transport, has been elected as the President of the National Assembly. Let's shift attention now to U.S.-Africa relations. After years of waiting for him to step on Sub-Saharan African soil, the President of the United States, Joe Biden, has visited Angola. Thousands of people lined the streets as Mr. Biden entered Angola's capital, Luanda. He first stopped in the Atlantic Ocean island nation of Cape Verde for a brief closed-door meeting with the Prime Minister. Mr. Biden's stay includes a meeting with Angola President João Lourenço, a visit to the National Slavery Museum, and a trip to the port city of Lobito for a look at a rail project. His visit comes weeks to the end of his presidency. President Biden promised to visit Africa last year after reviving the U.S.-Africa Summit in December 2022. The trip was pushed back to 2024 and delayed again this October because of Hurricane Milton. Now, for more on the U.S. President's visit to Africa, a global affairs analyst, Amuda Mosigodi, joins me now from Ibadan, your state, via Zoom. Good to have you join us, Amuda.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'm sure that, you have been anticipating this trip because it has been pushed, postponed rather, a lot of times. President Biden has been in Africa, but he has been in Egypt for the climate change conference there, but this time in Sub-Saharan Africa. What's the significance of this visit? With weeks just left in his presidency, is this visit coming a little too late?
Without doubt, the visit is coming a little bit too late. Don't forget that the Biden administration is wrapping up, and a new administration, which obviously does not take Africa into consideration, will be coming on board. However, there is also never a bad time to do a right thing. The Biden visit to Africa is coming on the heels of the non-relaxed drive of China and Russia into Africa. We've seen how China and Russia are making serious inroads into the continent. China has pledged $50 billion assistance in terms of infrastructure to Africa. And Russia is not also backtracking or backing down in the area. So the American government understands that, without doubt, they need to also step up. And we saw the U.S. consulate also telling Congress that the United States government needs to do a lot more if they are going to maintain their place of pride within Africa, and of course in terms of relations to Africa. So that explains why the visit becomes necessary. Don't also forget that one of the highlights of this visit is the Lobito corridor, where they will be launching the railway. And if you look at that project of course has a sort of semblance with what China is also doing, with China promoting rail across Africa. Talk of what we have in Uganda, talk of even Nigeria and some other African countries. So America is trying to wrap up and step up its game in terms of its presence in Africa. And that is why the Biden visit to Africa at this time, although similarly, is necessary.
That's the China Belt and Road Project, one of the biggest projects across the world by a single country. But we'll get to that in just a moment. I wanted to talk about this particular visit still. Does this do anything to reinvigorate the U.S.-African relations, or does this reinforce the sentiment among Africans that the continent is low priority for Washington?
If you look at what has always happened or what has happened from the 90s, in the 90s we saw Africa taking a very pivotal place in U.S. relations, even under someone like George Bush Jr. and even George Bush Sr. But over time, in the last 10 years, we've also seen that there's been a drop. So there's a question from the minds of many as regards whether Africa still, occupies that place of preference or that place of pride to America. And that explains why you see that there's this subtle embrace of China and Russia, who were obviously, Africa was a no-go area for them before now. In fact, in the 60s, you had a lot of countries in Africa banning materials and literatures coming from China and Russia. But now we see that these countries are already embracing them. So the visit of the president is coming on the heels of the need to strengthen American relations or the U.S. relations with Africa. Though, like I said earlier, a bit late, but then this may be the beginning of better things to come. Let's also not forget that there's been the argument across socialist movements, in Africa as regards the role of the IMF and, of course, the World Bank, who are seen as, an appendage of the Western government, particularly the United States, and the demonization of these institutions, thereby making a lot of African countries somehow reluctant in their engagement with America. We've seen how issues of debt have become a burden, and how China is becoming the new bride for African countries like this.
I will, if I have enough time, I will touch on China because I really think that that's an important component of this conversation. But you mentioned about how this could be the beginning of reinvigorating the U.S.-Africa relations. And I wanted to stay on that because when you look at the policies of President Donald Trump, whilst he was in office for his first term, he took a more transactional approach to Africa with the Prosper Africa initiative. It was really much about financing, helping U.S. companies do business easily in Africa. And he's returning in just a few weeks. Do you think that he would continue in that light? And then, because Biden also touched on the fact that his successor should, he's hoping that his successor will see the importance of the Lobito Corridor, railway project. What approach do you think that President-elect Donald Trump will take?
Well, the truth is, I do not see a change in, the Donald Trump approach to its relations to Africa. In fact, across globally, Donald Trump has always employed the transactional approach. We see how his approach, in terms of relations with even the EU and even allied countries has been. And that may not be any way different. Donald Trump, I believe, would want to review the Lobito contract and view how it's going to be beneficial because he has always reiterated that it is about American affairs. And so if we see through the Lobito infrastructure project, then it must be that project is bringing in more benefits to America and Americans, whether they are in Africa or not. So I do not see any difference being pursued by the Donald Trump administration. I strongly believe that he's going to review it and see whether it is not a case of hand-me-downs, which is one thing that he has maintained vehemently that he's against. He must see that this is something that is going to promote American interests first and above all.
And let's get to the China component, which I said was very important. I'd asked earlier if this visit was coming a little too late, but I asked that in the context of U.S.-African relations, and I want to look at that now in the context of the presence of China and Russia in Africa. China has, again, the biggest project in Africa. U.S. has AGOA, which has to do with the exports of agricultural commodities to the U.S. Now there is the Prosper Africa, how that is still working. And now there is Lobito Corridor. This is still very little when you put that in context of what China and Russia are doing. They're also looking at military bases in Africa. Let me just quickly touch on the fact that Donald Trump also reduced the number of military boots in Africa when he was in office from 5,000 to as low as, I think, is less than 2,000 now. Is this enough, the Lobito Corridor project, is it enough to counter China's presence rather, in Africa?
I don't think so. The Lovito Corridor project is nothing but a drop in the sea because in the last 10 years, I think the American government stepped off while America, China, like a thief in the night, was making serious inroads into Africa. If you look across countries, particularly in Eastern Africa, we've seen the heavy investment. Talk of Kenya, particularly in Mombasa, talk of Uganda, and a lot of other Eastern African countries. And of course, we come down to West Africa, and largely across the Sub-Saharan region, you see that China has established its presence without doubt. China has established its presence without doubt, and it will be difficult. America needs to do much more. America needs to also engage in serious orientation to move Africans away, particularly African state governments away from that mentality. We know what effect that the structural adjustment program that was undertaken by African countries, the impact it did or it had on African economies. And now America is like the leopard figure to be avoided. And so they need to do much more beyond the Loviso project to win the heart of Africa and African state governments back.
Interesting developments ahead. We'll continue to